So very briefly, if I can encapsulate this, so Mehrabian, this 73855 formula where he says only 7% of our communication is verbal, 38% is intonation, and the rest is non-verbal, right?
Your listeners, I can send you the link, can read Mehrabian himself saying that quote. So he himself has tried to, bust the myth of the how much 93% of talk is nonverbal, and talks about how frustrating it is that people, let's just say in a nutshell, took the research out of context, and yet it's such an appealing statistic. And he's interviewed by Max Atkinson, who. And the interview is really fascinating to read. And basically, Max Atkinson, nails it by saying, well, how can this be the case? Because how can anyone have a conversation on the phone then, or in the dark? Or why do people need to speak languages other than their own if 93% of the time they could get away with just non-verbals? So obviously, this doesn't really make sense.
Welcome back to another episode of SaltCubeAnalytics, a channel dedicated to analyze human behavior. My guest today is Elizabeth Stokoe, Professor of Social Interaction at Loughborough University. Elizabeth is a gifted speaker with a talent for translating her scientific findings into practical applications. I encourage you to have a look at her TEDx talk from Bermuda, where she explains the hidden dynamics of conversation and, more importantly, how to apply them to your own interactions. On one hand, the way we talk is more orderly than we would think, but I don't mean the structuring effect of grammar. For example, an answer delayed by a pause as short as 0.3 of a second conveys a meaning that most of us intuitively understand and emotionally react to, often without conscious awareness. On the other hand, and as counterintuitive as it sounds, talk is much less under our conscious control than is generally assumed. While we all keep talking, we often don't realize how complex the process of talk really is. To make sense, you first must think of words that can convey what you want to say. Then you have to formulate these words into sentences following all grammatical rules, while, at the same time, you have to produce intonation and body language which is congruent with your talk if you want people to believe what you are saying, and all of this in split seconds. If that is not demanding enough, you have to tailor your verbal communication for the specific audience you're communicating to, for the medium by which you're communicating, for the situation in which you are communicating, and for the purpose for which you're communicating. If you fail to do any of those correctly, people will instinctively perceive your talk as odd. We also discussed some of the myths concerning body language in this interview. The widely circulated concept that 93% of communication is nonverbal is easily debunked. If this would be true, nobody would have to learn another language or could communicate in the dark or on the phone. Elizabeth wrote in her book Talk, The Science of Communication, that the main group of people propagating this myth are presentation trainers, public speaking coaches, and other communication consultants. We know today that different types of words are processed in different parts of the brain, and that some words almost completely evade our conscious awareness. If you want to do a little self-experiments to verify what I just said, go to SaltCubeAnalytics.com, click on the words in the menu bar, and scroll down till you find Join us for a little experiment. So while amateurs focus on nonverbal communication, especially when it comes to deception detection, true professionals from academia and law enforcement focus on the words we say, and you can find several interviews with subject matter experts on this channel.
Okay, here we go. Elizabeth Stokoe, thank you so much for taking the time today. It's really, really appreciated. I'm especially interested in you and your research because I completed my Master's in Science Communication, Behavior and Credibility Analysis from the Met last year, and I used your research in my own. Yeah, so I'm really delighted talking to you. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. And congratulations on your Master's.
Thank you. Okay, but back to you. Now, I have more notes than I usually do. So if you see my eyes swerving around, it's not that you lose my attention. It's because I have notes everywhere on my screens here.
Yeah.
And it's also needed because of your CV, which is quite incredible. Yeah. So first of all, you are a professor of social interaction at the, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, Loughborough University.
That's great. Loughborough, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Loughborough. Okay. You are a associate dean for research for the School of Social, Political and Geopolitical Sciences.
No, that's out of date.
No? Yes? No?
No.
Out of date.
I was that. Yeah, I was Associate Dean for Research in my university for a bit, and then I was Associate Pro Vice Chancellor. But at the moment, I'm just an ordinary professor.
Ordinary professor. That's a euphemism, huh? Okay. Research interest, social interaction, of course, yeah. Conversation analysis, which we will talk in much more detail about it. Then police interrogation, very interesting. Hostage negotiations, community and family mediation, dating. You also give communication training, if I understood correctly.
Yeah. You
even developed your own, how's it called, a conversation analytic role play method. Yes. I have a question in between. What exactly are you doing here with that?
I am taking the findings from research in conversation analysis to develop training and guidance for organizations.
Yes, but in which context? I know you do it in mediation training because I heard a couple of speeches about this, yeah? But in what other contexts?
Pretty much all the contexts that you've mentioned. So really from the mediation research that I did back in the early to mid 2000s, all the way through since then, nearly all my research, every setting that I've studied has been with a partner, and at the end of the project, there will be some training.
Okay. Did you do anything for 911 services? 911, I don't know what's the number in the UK. Was it emergency services? Yeah,
we call it 999, but yes. So some of the most recent work that I'm doing with a colleague, Emma Richardson, is exactly on 999 emergency services in the particular case of domestic violence. And in settings, one of the challenges in these contexts is that the perpetrator might be in the same building when the call is made. And so one of the things we're interested in is how do you convey a genuine request for assistance to somebody on the other end of a phone who can't see what's happening in your house, and at the same time sound like to the person that might be in the house with you, like you're just talking to a friend or somebody else. So that's some work we're doing right now, and we have taken those findings back to the police partners.
Yeah, there's this famous case where a lady calls for a pizza to the police.
Yeah, that's one of the cases that I've analysed. Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Are there any other contexts in regards to, let's say, emergency services?
The suicide crisis negotiation, I suppose, is an emergency. And then I suppose I've also done research in sort of high stakes settings where, let's say, the outcome is, like life-threatening situations, but not necessarily always emergency, if that, medical situations, for example.
Okay. I'm asking for a specific reason, but I will come back to that one.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, in addition to all this academic work, you are quite an active speaker, I have found to my delight. The most known probably is your TEDx talk on the Bermudas, with, I think this morning was almost close to 1 million views. Yeah, so I will link that TEDx talk in the description of this video. It's absolutely worth watching. You're a speaker at the Royal Institute, a speaker at the New Scientist Live. You spoke at Google and Microsoft. I think I saw those talks of you, and on many other TV and YouTube interviews, channels, podcasts like this one. You're also the author of 4 books, one of which is Talk. I need to see myself. Yes, Talk here. I found something interesting in this book also. We will come back to this later. You are the author of many chapters in other people's books, and of course, how many scientific research papers you have written? I lost track.
Yeah, quite a lot. Me too. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I lost count at maybe 50, so maybe there's about 150. I don't know.
A little prelude, a little question in between. So, did you do anything on deception detection, verbal linguistic use of deception, anything like that?
Not probably in the terms that you have mentioned them, but I am interested in what people might typically think of as cues to deception that turn out not to be when you look at real interaction, that they're much more part of other actions in interaction. But also I am interested in because I've done quite a lot of work on police interviews with suspects, where at least for the purposes of this interaction, you can see and you kind of know whether or not this suspect was charged and convicted, if you like. So you can have a look at the interview to see, as they go through the interview, what changes from the suspect's account. So, for example, they might say, I didn't do that, and I didn't do that, and I didn't do that. And then by the end of it, they're saying, I did do this, and I did do this. And so whether or not you would see those earlier denials as lying or not, or basically it's like a negotiation of what counts as the truth for the purposes of being arrested, and both the suspects and the police in those situations are oriented to, maybe for the police's point of view, what can we formulate from the suspect's account into things that can be categorizable as a crime, which is something. And then from the suspect's point of view, it's how can I explain myself in ways that minimize the chances of those being categorizable as a crime. And so actually, a lot of the time it's not as simple as truth and lies, it's something else.
We will definitely come back to that, but you're absolutely right. Truth and lies is not black and white. They're often intermingled. Before we do, however, so you're a psychologist by training, right?
Yeah.
What was your, if there was any, what was your epiphany moment that brought you in direction of verbal, linguistics, pragmatics instead of, say, nonverbals?
It's just complete chance. So I did a very traditional psychology degree, experiments and lab work and so on. And then after my degree, I was just looking for postgraduate opportunities and happened to apply for a PhD position and happened to have an immediate connection to the woman who became my PhD supervisor. And her research was on, I suppose, quite early, the foundations and early work around children interacting with, very old-fashioned now computers in the classroom. So that was her interest, children working in groups with a computer. And so she was collecting video interaction of those, again, very old technology now. And so I became interested in a side project of that, if you like, which was how do students work in groups but in universities, because at that point there's hardly any work on university classrooms. All the classroom work was on school classrooms. And so I had these video recordings of students working in classes, and I had ideas about what I might be interested in, and some of them fell away and some of them became more important. And then along the way, she gave me a copy of the Harvey Sachs's Lectures in Conversation, which is like some of the foundational work in my field. And to be honest, the one thing that really, one of the things that really made me think I can get interested in this is that the transcripts of the data looked like I could do them, because quite a lot of work in psychology at this point, and bearing in mind I'm a psychologist and not working in sociology or linguistics or anywhere that conversation analysts typically work. And of course, conversation analysis goes back a long time, but in my field, in psychology, there weren't many people at all doing that kind of work, or working with naturally occurring materials like video recordings. Much more typically, if you were doing, let's say, qualitative research, you were working with interview materials. And so in those cases, there's quite a lot, even at that time in the early 90s, of, how to work with interview materials. But my data didn't look like interview data. It didn't have a question and a big chunk of text and a question. It was all interactional. And so these lectures not only gave me a sense of, okay, here's a bounded method of how to analyze, but I can make transcripts that look like that as well. And I know I can kind of see it fitting together. So really it was that, the combination of chance, several chances that all worked out quite well.
I interviewed Jack Schaefer last week. Jack Schaefer is a former FBI special agent with 20 years of experience. What makes him especially attractive is because he is a university professor, right? He wrote his PhD on text bridges. I also used his work in my own research. And he told me exactly the same thing. He said, Thomas, I'm sorry, I have no sexy story. They just told me to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think,
Okay.
yeah, over the years, I think I've had lots of luck, or opportunities that and just kind of learned to follow my nose, as we say, follow my nose. Yeah.
Yeah. We will come to misconceptions of nonverbal communication a little bit later. But since we talk about talk right now, what are the common misconceptions about talk? For example, I mean, James Pennebaker, I'm pretty sure you know his research. Yeah? We do not have control over what we are saying, at least not to the degree that it's commonly assumed. Yeah. So what's your take on misconceptions in regards to language, talk, how we talk, how much control we have, etc., etc.?
How much control we have is interesting because on the one hand, conversation analysts reveal things about how conversation works that people typically are surprised by. For example, how messy it is, even when you sound very articulate, when you actually do a transcript, you see all the hesitations and ums and breaths and restarts, and that's very typical and normal, except that we look far less fluent than we feel we are when we study interactions using conversation analysis. So that's one thing. So we're messier, but we're also attuned to things. So I was actually watching a television program yesterday where somebody. It's kind of, you can't believe you've actually captured it on a bit of video, so I might transcribe this, where somebody makes that classic kind of almost like fictional mistake of calling their partner by the wrong name, calling their partner by their ex-partner's name. And of course so those are the things that, it's a very typical example where, we can all start to read in, what did they really mean? Do they really like the ex-partner? What does all that mean? And to actually capture that moment live is quite unusual. So I might go and transcribe that. But of course, immediately people are very much attending to, so maybe they weren't in control when they make, say, the wrong name, and then they are in control like split seconds later when they do the repair and fix things. So I think people are, when you actually look at transcripts again, what you see is that people are very much oriented to how they're talking, and so it's not quite the same as whether they're in control or not. Like if I'm talking to you and I start to talk about I don't know, Tracy, you're like, who's Tracy? So I can't I can't say, oh, Tracy. I'd have to say, oh, one of the people I work with, and I would fix that as I'm going along. So it's not a matter of whether I'm in control of whether or not I say Tracy. It's more to do with we tend to orient to what we're doing as we're doing it, and quite often fix things as we're going along. So I think there are lots of misconceptions just at the level of the empirical reality of social interaction and what it really looks like when you study it in this way. And then there are bunches of others. The most common ones, I would argue, are about gender differences in interaction, about body language in inverted commas, and also that conversation analysts are often assumed to only be interested in, let's say, words rather than embodied conduct, and that's just not true. That the whole field, especially as we were able to capture video and much more of the interaction with technology. There are lots and lots of experts and lots of analysis of just embodied conduct, but actually this gives me an opportunity to say that conversation analysts are interested in action, in interaction. So we might be seen as interested in words and talking, and that's true, but actually the primary focus is on action that is being done. So if you're making a request of somebody, there are lots of different ways of making a request. You can use words. If you're using sign language, you would use sign language. If you can use gestures, like make me a cup of tea, just that, or what's the time, or get off the phone, or so we have lots of resources for interacting and constructing action, and that's what conversation analysts are interested in. Sometimes it's words, sometimes it's gestures. All of these things work in aggregate to make meaning.
Yeah, and we definitely do things with talk. We do things. Yeah, but coming back for one second to Pennebaker, there is another layer of control, right? So I'm sure you know. Yeah. So Pennebaker divides talk into function words and content words, right? And where function words, action verbs, adjectives, nouns, etc., function words, pronouns, articles, prepositions, etc. Yeah. The interesting part is you as a native English speaker, you have about 100,000 words kind of active in your vocabulary. 20,000 of them you use all the time. But those function words, they're only 450. That's 0.5%. And what makes them interesting is for two reasons. First of all, we use them 55% of the time, and they're processed in a different part of the brain. That means if I as a speaker would not try to control my function words, it would cost me so much cognitive load that I would no longer be able to speak coherently. And you, for example, as a police officer trying to focus on those function words, same thing for you. You would no longer be able to listen to what I'm really saying, right? But especially pronouns and articles, right? They tell us something, how close somebody is, how much responsibility somebody takes for a specific activity. Yeah. So there are multiple layers where one could have control or not. So my question to you is, with all your knowledge, you can't put a number on it. Yeah, I know that. Yeah. But how do you see people when they are conversing? And I'm not even talking about self-deception. Yeah. This kind of thing, or cognitive biases, even worse, right? So how much in control are we really about what we are saying?
I think I just wouldn't ask the question that way. Because I'm also interested to know what would count as a function word, just out of interest, because I know Pennebaker's work a little bit. I met him once at a seminar, but not close enough to make any sensible comments. So I am intrigued to know what a function word would be.
So he describes all those little grammatical words, which are the glue that puts our talk together. Yeah, pronouns, articles, prepositions, negations, these kind of things. He has a really interesting he has a really interesting book, the Secret Life of Pronouns. I read it, I think, 3 times. It's really, it's really interesting to read. Yeah.
So the only bit of work that I've read a little bit is the idea of pronouns and when people say I and we, and I think a connection to depression and mental health, that kind of thing. That's what I remember reading about. And for me, all of the things that we have just kind of hinted at and glossed over quickly, I suppose I just want to see what they look like in naturally occurring interaction. So I don't know, like I would never start with the idea that you can have something called a function word separate from the turn and the context in which it's produced and the action that it's doing. So it's really hard to talk about things like function words versus other types of words and how much we're in control, and even things like I and we. So I and we would very much be things that would be sometimes part of what a conversation analyst is studying. One of the areas of interest is quite often how much agency people are ascribing to themselves and other parties, and it's also really interesting to see how people shift between pronouns, so shift between I will do something versus we will, and who is the we and who is the you, and people will often repair from I to we and so on as well. So all of these things in actions, in sequences of interaction, is how we would approach thinking about what these things are doing, and there is lots of research in those areas. We just probably wouldn't reduce them to buckets and codes of things that you could say things about out of context.
Yeah. I have an example from a true FBI investigation. Yeah, it's one sentence and one word gave the betrayal away, right, or the deception away, right? Yeah. It goes something like this. Yeah. The statement was from a young woman: someone came from behind, put something over my head, and put me into the car. I say it again. Somebody came from behind, put something over my back, and put me into the car. You spot it?
No, and because I'm already thinking about in what sequence did this, in response to what, I would need to sit with recording. I'd need to make a transcript. It's hard to do analysis off the cuff.
It's a definite article, the car. That means she saw
right.
this car already. Otherwise, it would have been a car, right? It's not a surefire
Yeah.
sign that she was lying, which at the end it turned out she did. Yeah, but it's a point to come
Yeah.
back and question the point, right?
Yeah.
These kind of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
I remember seeing a really nice example of forensic linguists showing. I'm now going to forget the name of the person who conducted this research, but basically sort of showing how this text message could not have been authored by the person it was apparently authored by, and this was kind of key to the case, and it was to do with things like how people typically misspelled words. So like if you're writing an SMS and you always abbreviate a particular word, and then if you're trying to replicate the way that person writes and you also do some abbreviations but you get them wrong, then this was the cue. It's similar kind of thing, this was the cue to the deception that people are trying to um, they're trying to recreate someone else's language in this case and failing on the very small details.
So, with your kind permission, I would like to set the stage a little bit, but again, it's a loose framework. Yeah, we don't have to stick to it. Yeah. So, based on my background, but also on my own study, I'm interested in deception, what I said already, and specifically in regards to omissions, because I did my own research where 30 senior executives from one of the largest companies in the world participated. And I refer explicitly in my thesis to your paper in regards to simulation. So those people, they played themselves, senior managers, no simulation there. They were negotiating specific live business cases. Yeah, they were so realistic that I had to embargo the scripts that I wrote for the negotiations. I knew the ground truth, right? So we know that deception in negotiation happens. There's there is ample evidence and a lot of scientific papers pointing out that deception in negotiation happen. Some even point out, in order to be successful, you have to be deceptive in negotiations, right? So it's a really vast field, yeah. The point is, contrary to popular belief, most people, inclusive managers and professional negotiators, they do not like to lie, and especially not outright. Much too risky, right? So what they're doing is they're reverting to avoidance strategies. Yeah. So in my paper, I grouped 6 avoidance strategies under the umbrella of avoidance. And that's also what we saw, right? So if we could go in that direction, so I grouped ambiguity, concealment, dodging questions, equivocation, evasion, half-truths, vagueness, for each of which you can find, I don't know how many research papers for each of those that I just named, right? Yeah. I grouped them. Yeah. So if we can get into that, again, we don't have to stick to it. This is just the entry point. Yeah. But from your experience, from you as a conversation analyst, is there anything that could be of value for professional negotiators, for professional managers, let's say tomorrow in the next negotiation?
So I have studied contexts in which there is some element of negotiation and persuasion. And so maybe my starting point for thinking about this is looking at encounters where the parties start from a different position. So, for example, if somebody is cold called by a salesperson and they start off saying, no, I'm not interested in your photocopiers, but by the end of the call, they've said, yes, you can come and show me, the salesperson wants an appointment. And so what is it that across that encounter do you see as a sort of turning point from I don't want to make an appointment to see you to, yes, okay, I'll see you. Same for suicide crisis negotiation. So the starting point is the person is on a roof threatening to take their own lives, and by the end of the encounter, they come down safely. Same with mediation calls. So a lot of my work started with these initial inquiry calls where people are telephoning mediation services. They don't know what mediation services are. They're not phoning to make an appointment. They're phoning because someone told them to call this organization. And when they hear what mediation is, they don't really want mediation. So again, it's looking at the way people go from, no, I'm not interested, to, okay, I'll make an appointment. Because in these situations, what you have which quite a lot of psychology research doesn't really give you direct access to, is settings in which the outcome of the negotiation really matters to both parties, right? And it's real stakes for both of them, rather than simulations or experimentally lab produced situations where the stakes just aren't the same. There are some stakes in them, but they're different. So that this would be my starting point to think about negotiation and shift from a no to a yes, let's say. And some of the things that all of those settings share, which people might find surprising at all, that these settings that seem quite diverse do have interactional things in common, are to do with the sort of agency and independence of the person who is changing their mind. And I say changing their mind very deliberately, because myself and a colleague, Bogdana Humer, wrote a paper where we showed that the goal of these negotiations is to get the person who you're trying to persuade, if you like, or to change their stance, to independently decide to take a different stance toward the thing that they originally had a different position with regards to. So what we see is that people, they resist efforts at persuasion, but if you give people the space to talk about things they've already decided to do today and get them to talk about their own decision making, then people may change their mind, and they will show deliberation, and they will show when you've gone from a hard position to a different position, you have to think about how am I coming across? Do I come across a bit crazy? Like I seem to change my mind way too quickly. Do I blow with the wind, or do I have my own sort of integrity of thought? And so in each of those settings, the cold call, sales call, the mediation call, the crisis negotiation, when people shift from I don't want to make an appointment with you, I don't want to mediate, I'm standing on this roof and I'm going to jump to the other side, what they all have in common is the interaction. The professional party is laying the interactional foundations for that person to decide for themselves, even though of course they are taking turns all the way through with the professional party. But that's what I see in common.
And if you go back, you mentioned at the beginning you did research police interviews, yeah? So is there any insight in regards to deception, verbal cues of deception?
So moving from negotiation to more deception, like I said a bit earlier, deception is to me not as straightforward. It's deceptive or not, because if you say to someone, how are you doing? And they say, fine, that might be a lie, but it's inconsequential. It's just part of the sort of oils of the wheels of social life. So we have to be much more careful, I think, about what we see as deception for a start. And of course, there are some settings where deception is the business. And so that's different. Police interviews are a different setting to other ones because the stakes are different. And that also starts to get you to see how, if you're an actor playing the part of a suspect in a training police interview, then and you're looking to see how, are there cues to deception there? You can hopefully already start to see, well, the actor doesn't have the same stake in this encounter as the real suspect. So if the actor's lying, and by lying, let's say they're deviating from the script, or like they're doing things that are overtly a lie according to what they're meant to be saying, then all of this starts to get a bit messy. So I think it's important to focus on what is actually going on in the setting for both the parties, what's at stake for them, to then think about what deception might mean in this context. And so, as you mentioned, one of the settings that I've studied is role play and simulation. So I'll just give you an example of a different, more recent piece of research. So I've looked at police interviews with real suspects and police interviews with actors playing the part of suspects to see how different they look. But of course, in the role play, everyone knows they're in a role play. I mean, the whole role play you could argue is a deception, because it's not real. No one's telling the truth that day. But
Agreed.
But that already that we also sort of think, well, we don't really mean that by deception. But another setting is mystery shopping. So again, with some colleagues, we did some research where we compared people telephoning the vet, and they really have a pet, so they're navigating making an appointment or getting care for their animal, versus mystery shoppers or simulated clients who are phoning to test out the experience of calling and then report back to the organization about how good the service provision was. So these are really interesting because the people taking the call don't know that they're talking to a mystery shopper. And when you look at just one call, you can't tell that this isn't a real pet owner either, because just on one call, we all tend to operate on the basis that we're talking to people who have integrity. Otherwise you couldn't have any encounter ever if you were always thinking, is this an actor, is this a mystery shopper, like what is this? So you can't see on a one-off, but when you look at a larger corpus and compare, you can start to see really interesting things about the mystery shopper. And the mystery shopper is being deceptive because they don't really have the animal that they're claiming to phone up about. What they typically do with the compared to real pet owners is they ask for different things. So, for example, a real pet owner will ask about an appointment for their animal, and a mystery shopper will ask about the cost of services. And actually, this is interesting because it comes back to what you were saying earlier about pronouns and what gives things away. So typically, as well, the real pet owner will say, I'd like to make an appointment for my dog. Whereas a mystery shopper will say, how much would it cost to get a dog vaccinated? So they use the indefinite article rather than a possessive pronoun, which is interesting. And so you can't notice that from a distance, but when you look at all of the data together, you start to see that mystery shoppers and real pet owners do a lot of things differently. And this also then starts to get us maybe towards things that you could do much bigger studies on around deception. Because the other thing that we see is, or started to see, and I wish we had a bigger data set to really interrogate this, was in both the mystery shoppers and the real callers, when people are saying why they're calling today. So mystery shoppers typically ask about the price of a service. Real pet owners typically ask for an appointment to bring their animal to the vet. But those requests are also full of the sort of hesitancy and repair and a bit of and a bit of breathing, all the things that we do when we're talking. But they seem to be a little bit different in the mystery shoppers. So I can't say that this is a definitive finding. We would need more data. But what we could start to see was that perhaps the real pet owner hesitates in a different place to the mystery shopper. And so that when someone goes, they do it in a different place. And so maybe, I don't know what that's telling you about deception, but it's telling you something interesting about maybe authenticity. And maybe authenticity might be a different way to think about this whole issue.
I found a similar thing. So in my own research, speech interruptions, ums, etc., I thought it's not necessarily related to deception. It's a stress signal, yeah. But I have in my own data set, I see on some occasions a clear increase of those speech interruptions. The closer you get to the key point, yeah, the higher the stakes get, the more of those speech interruptions there were, right? So I'm mindful here that yes, it's a stress indicator, right? Cognitive load, etc. But again, I have seen it in my own data set where I have the ground truth. So I knew when they were bending the truth or omitting crucial information, right? I saw clearly these kind of speech interruptions, which I thought is a stereotypical, deception sign. Yeah. What's your take on this?
I'm not totally clear from what you said about whether you're studying simulation, like very authentic simulations or actual negotiations. Yeah. But what I would say, ums and ahs are really regular parts of social interaction and turn building. And there's, again, lots of research on turn initial ers, where they happen when I just did one now, when I'm kind of searching for the next thing to say, buying time. We're using those things to do, a range of actions and a range of functions. And so I think for me, I would just always want to sort of slightly resist the idea that you could immediately map it to something which is much more interesting, for a lot of people. Oh, that means they're lying. When in fact, it just means they're just sort of like grappling around for the next thing to say. The other place where, of course, it's really tempting to read psychologize what's going on, and maybe there's something to this as well, is that the more difficult the topic is somehow, and I don't think that's necessarily just about stress in a gross way or cognitive load in another way, but I occasionally will transcribe some politicians answering questions, and you can see that the more accountable or less accountable they might see themselves as to getting this answer right now in this live broadcast, then you start to see hesitations, repairs, more and more stumbling, and equivocation and all those kinds of things. So I think the problem is trying to get that balance between people seeing loads and loads of hesitations or stumblings, and they think that is telling us something about that person, because what people are often doing is contrasting that with what they imagine ordinary smooth production of talk is, which brings us back to kind of where we started, which is when you record and transcribe real interaction, it's full of that stuff. So the baselines are different. I think people imagine all those hesitations as indicating something when in fact talk is full of it. So where do you draw the line, if you like, between this is an extra amount of that stuff and this is a normal amount of that stuff?
Very difficult. Yeah, indeed. Can we go? I tried one more time. Yeah. Deception detection, verbal deception detection. And I actually, when I was referring to the negotiations, I meant not negotiations. I meant deceptions in negotiations, right? But the context actually doesn't really matter. Yeah. So either in your studies from the police interviews, were you able to detect, or in general of all your vast experience and research, were you able to point out some verbal deception cues with statistic relevance? No,
I've never done that kind of work. No.
Okay.
No, but I do have examples of, like I say, police interviews where you can see the account shifting and changing over the course of the interview. And I suppose what you could then think is, well, if we go back to look at that first response, which is now, like 50 minutes later, it's completely different, then maybe you go back actually and have a look at how that apparent lie was produced. Because if you like, to the best of your knowledge, you've got the evidence within the actual encounter that earlier on that was a lie, if you like, or at least it was a deception, or it was not an authentic, however you want to call it. It was and now those events are being described, formulated differently. Sometimes it's very subtle. Sometimes it might be to do with, the verb. Is it a transitive or intransitive verb, or how much of the action are people taking on themselves? So, for example, did they fall or were they pushed? People suspects are very attuned to talking about whether or not somebody fell over or whether they were pushed, and of course in the end they're on the ground, but how did they get there? And all of these things are, very carefully oriented to, and you can see often suspects sort of struggling with quite how much they're going to say at this point, and then later on, if there's more evidence, they might have to change that a bit. But it's very, very incremental, I suppose. So the idea that there's a lie here and a truth here, it's much more incremental than that, maybe, which is interesting. The other thing that I've often thought I would do a study of, but I surely people have done this by now, is because they're sort of fascinating in a sort of gruesome way for a lot of people, is when there's a crime occurring and you get this sense that it's going to be a family member, and then you have these public news broadcasts where the family will do the appeal for the missing child, and then it turns out that at one, so could you go back to look at those broadcasts and see if there's anything in the behaviour of the person making the appeal that would actually, I can't, these things must be scrutinised, but I think it's, for me, I would want to find settings where they're just part of the routine work of the organisation. They're part of the police's work, rather than me trying to set up an experiment that is slightly adjacent to their action. I'm just wanting to always, like a conversation analyst would, I just want to focus on the police recordings, because and police recordings are great because they make them anyway as part of the legal process. And there, what you have is everything that anyone is ever going to need and use to make a conviction or not. So there's no extras. There's nothing else. It's just like, here's the interview and the evidence. And in this, at the end, some kind of objective truth comes out as an outcome of the process.
Yeah. I think Cliff Lansley, also from Manchester, he did his PhD on these kind of cases that you mentioned, analyzing public appeals, I think they're called, right? There's quite some research on that. Yeah. Liz, if we switch,
yeah, I should go and look.
I can send you some material about this. Yeah. Liz, if we switch,
please do. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested as an ordinary person, Yeah.
Okay. If we switch now over, let's say on the other side, how we use words, let's say to manipulate. Yeah. We could call it priming, manipulation, nudging, whatever, right? Now there is a study, I think from the Stanford University in regards, so they asked people, is crime a virus or a beast? Yeah. And this so they had two control groups, right? One, they ask, is crime a virus? And the other, is crime a beast? And then they ask the participants to describe what they would do in order to address the issue, right? And if it's a crime, they were very often aligned in putting people in jail. And if it's a virus, they're very, very often inclined to put people in a hospital, right? So we do things with words. We are very receptive to manipulation via words. And that's also something that is by far not appreciated by the public. And to put this more in the context of contemporary, so from today, right? And I don't want to go political. Yeah, it's just this one statement that I will make. Yeah. So the way how Putin is framed today in the Western media says something about what the population is being prepared for, right? So we can look at what emotions are being tried to be created in order to see which direction, we are, how do you call it? Nudged, manipulated, pushed, whatever, right? Is that something is that a point of view that you share? I mean, not about Putin. I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm interested in this from the perspective of the kind of research that you just mentioned. And actually, it reminds me of research conducted by Elizabeth Loftus and colleagues from the 70s forwards on eyewitness testimony, and this gorgeous study that I remember learning about it when I was an undergraduate, and I often refer to it now, in which people were shown a video of an automobile accident, and they're asked to estimate the speed at which the cars were travelling when they collided, and the estimates changed depending on the verb used to solicit the information. So I think they changed, at what speed was the car traveling when it bumped,
or crashed,
collided, smashed, crashed. Yeah. And that's really a really gorgeous demonstration of how verb changes are going to impact something that is, collected as so-called hard data. And then, I think it was a follow-up question a week later. They asked participants if they saw glass at the scene, and those participants who'd been asked, I think the smashed version of the question, were more likely to report glass, even though there was no glass. So I think, that's really fascinating, sort of almost like inducing memories that weren't there and shaping the data that you collect later. From a conversation analytic point of view, again, I'm interested in how across a sequence or an episode of interaction, you can see people changing words and verbs and effectively changing the type of response that they get next. And I suppose my favourite example of this from my own work is looking at the way those mediators in those initial conversations with people who are resistant to mediating, at some point will say to people, having explained what mediation is that something that sounds helpful? Are you interested in mediating? Would you like to mediate? There's lots of different ways of asking that, the business end of the conversation. So like, are you going to be a client or not? And basically, what I found was that people may or may not say that they're interested in mediating, but if they're asked if they're willing to mediate or if they'd be willing to meet the mediators, then people in the data, they always said yes. And in fact, they didn't just say yes, they would say a really enthusiastic and endorsing kind of like, oh, of course I'm willing. And it's worth just unpacking that for just a few more seconds, because it speaks to the sort of the moral context in which some interactions are happening, or like where the moral sense of who you are is really important. So if you are a potential mediation client, you've got a dispute with somebody for a long time, the starting point is I'm nice and the other person is horrible. And so one of the ways in which people resist getting involved in mediation is by saying the other person's the kind of person who won't mediate. But if they're the horrible party and you're the nice one, then you must be the kind of person who will. And so what I found was that mediators, and sometimes this would be the same mediator sort of feeling their way through this encounter, not giving up. Very typical if people say, are you interested in mediating? No, I'm not really. And, the other person won't mediate. That the mediator sort of gives up and says, oh, okay, then, I'll just send you a leaflet if you change your mind. Whereas, this one mediator that I first started to notice after that resistance would say, but you'd be willing to see two of the mediators, and you get this immediate transformation or change, like, oh, of course, yes, I'm willing. And what this mediator seemed to be tacitly picking up on is, if I give this person the opportunity to say, not just, yes, I'm interested, but I'm the kind of person who tries to resolve things, then people will take it, because the stake for them is in showing that they're the nice party. And so having found this one case, we then found it everywhere in our data. And so there, you've got this finding as part of a naturally occurring experiment. And in a way, this is what conversation analysts are often doing. It's how do people feel their way through an encounter, change things, fix things, get to the point where people might be poles apart at the start, and then gradually they come together. What is it that's making that difference? And sometimes it really is to do with individual words. And of course, they're embedded in particular kinds of turns as well. But it's fascinating to see these happening naturally, not just in experimental situations.
Yeah. So that was a nice example, again, of one word changing the outcome of a potentially personally impacting situation, right? You have more examples of that. I will, again, there's some other speeches where you elaborate on this, so we don't have to repeat it here. I will put the links in the description of this video. However, what I would like for you to outline is your racetrack.
Yeah. So when I started to talk about conversation analysis to people who weren't conversation analysts or weren't academics, I wanted to, I myself was feeling my way through, like, what is going to land with an audience, what will make sense. And so I just started to talk about this idea that conversation is like a racetrack. It has an architecture to it. It has a landscape, and you move around the racetrack. Sometimes I say, or the golf course or the horse, whatever is your preference. But this idea that you start at the beginning with your recipient or recipients, and then you move along the encounter. And the encounter has a structure to it. So although every interaction is on the one hand unique, when the sort of macro organization of an interaction, it will follow, certain activities. So, in a call to the doctors, there'll be the greetings, and then there'll be the explanation of the problem, the reason for the call, and then there'll be some questions and answers maybe, and then there'll be, so they kind of moves through these phases. And for me as an analyst, sometimes I'm looking at how does this particular moment along the racetrack, which seems to, either people are very smooth at this point, or they kind of crash into each other at this point. So what is it that seems to be making the difference at this point along the way? And so this idea of an unfolding road, which has some things that are a bit unknown, but some, probably some known hurdles. And certainly once you're looking at, tens, hundreds, or, sometimes thousands of cases of the same racetrack. So let's have a look at, what happens on a first date. They all seem to go along this way. They all start to go wrong or better at this point. This is the turning point where people are going to be like, I'm into it or I'm not into it. So this is the analogy that seems to get people to understand. And what I also say, for people at work is it's really important to know your racetrack. And so for those mediators taking those initial inquiry calls, one of the big points of a crash was when mediators started to explain what mediation is. And some would explain it one way and some would explain it another way. And, depending on how they did that, people would start to engage or disengage. And you have to know that that's coming. And I think one final point about this is that the fact is that in those mediation calls, and you can extrapolate this to everywhere else, the mediators, they're trying to get people to become their client. So the idea that people can easily know what they're doing in this sense of they have control over it. The mediators who explain mediation in a particular way and it puts people off, they're not trying to put people off. They're trying to get people to join their organization. So presumably they don't realize that every time they do that thing, it's really off-putting. So that's, on the one hand, it's not in their control. But in the other hand, it kind of is, because mediators aren't born knowing about mediation. The organization has trained them, and the organization has got this way of doing that thing that you can actually change. So then you can, get a bit more sense of right, when it gets to this point along the racetrack, we'll do this other thing because we're normally in control at that point. So we'll change what we say at this point, and we know that it's probably going to have a better outcome.
Okay. So what you're saying is, first of all, our talk, our communication is not random. It's not chaotic. There's structure, there's system, right? And the second thing, what you're saying is this, let's say, call it racetrack, is depending on the context. So if you call your GP, if you're in a police interview, or if you're in a mediation situation, the racetrack is different depending on the context, right? If I understand you correctly.
It is. It is and it isn't, because I think maybe one other thing to note at this point is that the context isn't just a bucket, so that if you're calling the doctors, everything makes sense and we all know that we're calling the doctors. And I think actually that the call that you mentioned earlier, that what I was talking about, 999 call, so somebody phoning up and saying, I'd like to order a pizza for delivery, that doesn't make sense to the person taking the call because it's the police. It's tempting to say, well, it's a police racetrack, so that's why it gets treated seriously. Because actually, I also have examples where people phone up with what sound like, things that just aren't fitted to the police, and they get treated as, this is a nuisance call. This is not an emergency call. This is a malicious call. So if a key task for the police call taker is to sift genuine from malicious, from nuisance, from accidental calls, which is a huge part of their job, then it isn't the context that's helping that. It's actually really interesting and I think quite robust interactional things that the genuine call takers are doing. So it's totally possible to phone the police and ask for a pizza and sound to whoever might be overhearing you as though you're talking to pizza. And we have other examples of that. That was an American call. We have British calls where people are doing similar sorts of things. They are, from the person overhearing, they sound like they're talking to a friend, but to the police officer, they can tell this is genuine, and they move into the same thing that the pizza call does, which is to ask yes, no questions to allow the person to just say yes or no and get all the information relevant. But context is you can't just throw context and say that's why this all makes sense, because that isn't quite right either.
I was more referring to police interviews where, I'm assuming the police has a certain, step-by-step approach in regards to police interviews, but I'm with you when it comes to somebody calling in with such a case. It's completely out of context. And I have researched another case exactly in that correlation here. Again, someone called the police, a woman who has been stabbed. It took the police 7 hours to come there because they didn't believe her, and she died. Right. So it's this balancing act between what is now real, what's not real. Right.
There's a very famous study in my field conducted by Jack Whalen and Don Zimmerman, I think. It's called When Words Fail, and it's a single case analysis of a 911 call that fails to get the assistance, and there's a tragic outcome. So yeah, every case is really interesting to look at.
Okay, Liz, can we come to, I cannot avoid not to talk about non-verbal communication, right? And of course, I have your book in front of me on page 118. You write, if I can quote this, the main group of people who have propagated the Mehrabian myth, and we're going to discuss what that is, right? are presentation trainers, public speakers, coaches, and other communication consultants. Yeah. So very briefly, if I can encapsulate this, so Mehrabian, which is still alive, and I tried to reach out to him so far unsuccessfully, came up with this 73855 formula where he says only 7% of our communication is verbal, 38% is intonation, and the rest is non-verbal, right? Please give me a take on this.
Your listeners, I can send you the link, can read Mehrabian himself saying that quote. So he himself has tried to, bust the myth of the how much 93% of talk is nonverbal, and talks about how frustrating it is that people, let's just say in a nutshell, took the research out of context, and yet it's such an appealing statistic. And he's interviewed by Max Atkinson, who. And the interview is really fascinating to read. And basically, Max Atkinson, nails it by saying, well, how can this be the case? Because how can anyone have a conversation on the phone then, or in the dark? Or why do people need to speak languages other than their own if 93% of the time they could get away with just non-verbals? So obviously, this doesn't really make sense, but it's very compelling. And the problem with communication is we all have our lifetime's experience to reflect on and to draw on our anecdata to think about, well, this is how I talk, and so that makes the very appealing things that we think we know about communications, we just like to think that we're experts in this area, but actually when you start to study real talk in real time, recording, transcribing, then a lot of these things just fall away. But it is a bit like, again, trying to stop a juggernaut. People just will assert at you, but this is definitely the case, and I definitely said this at this time, and so on. And sometimes you fight it, and sometimes you think, well, it doesn't really matter. But where it does matter is where, for example, people are being trained and assessed on their communication skills on the basis of normative things that don't really make any sense interactionally, and then people's careers and employment and someone's life might be at stake.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. And on Mehrabian's website, you can also read that he really tries to rectify this misconception of his. That doesn't take away. I've studied police manuals, both in the UK and in America. Many of those misconceptions, those non-verbal misconceptions, are in those manuals, right? Very briefly, I would like to cite the study of it's called the Global Deception Detection Team. Yeah, it's actually a group of researchers. I don't know how many, but they have published a paper. They studied in 75 different countries what people think is a deception indicator, right? It's twice 75. Yeah, so in 75 countries in 43 languages, but in those 75 countries, 75% of the people believe that's the number one deception indicator, what they believe. If I cannot look you in the eyes as a gaze aversion, then I must be lying. Also, first of all, it's completely wrong. We know from science it's the opposite, because liars actually look longer in your eyes because they know if they look away, you think they're lying, right? But this belief is so ingrained, and many others are so ingrained, it's very hard to get them out. Yeah. I had a very good interview with Dr. Abe Marono not so long ago. She completely, she focuses on nonverbal communication, but she's very lucid in regards what you can and cannot do. Same thing, right? But how can you get such an ingrained popular belief, which is propagated in, I don't know how many books behind me, yeah, even from so-called communication expert, even from some academics, I have to say, right? How can you get something like this out of popular culture almost? Because it does destroy careers. It does destroy.
Yeah. If I knew that, I guess I would. Well, that would be job done. But yeah, it's frustrating. But I think to a greater or lesser extent, all of life is like that. People firmly believe the opposite to what you believe about a lot of different things. It is very frustrating about communication when there is expertise. But then look at the pandemic. People believe or choose not to believe in all sorts of things to do with coronavirus, and that's sadly humans. I think one of the things I often say in my talks is that communication is something that people treat as fundamental and key. If you Google communication is, the algorithm will helpfully complete that sentence for you in, with key or something like that. And so everyone knows that communication is really important, right up until the point at which you're prepared to look at actually what's happening when people are communicating. But that's what conversation analysts do, and that's what the field has been doing for over 50 years.
Okay. Liz, I'm aware we are on the top of the hour. I have one last thing in regards to communication and talk, right? The Nixon tapes, right? So President Nixon in this Watergate scandal, at the beginning, the first singular pronoun I, right? So usually he only used it throughout his presidency about 2% of the time. The more his power deteriorated, the higher was his usage of the personal pronoun I at the end, up to 8%. Now, I don't know what's the average. I don't know how, I have no clue, but that says that you can determine the perceived status, hierarchy, power of someone on that particular word. Yeah. So I'm hearing that leaders, for example, they don't use I, they use we, and liars, they also don't use I, and, to distance themselves. But apparently if you're losing your power, that also changes your use of the pronouns. Is that something that you have seen in your own research?
I don't know, but you know what? You could look, because one of the other founders of our field who invented the transcription system, Gail Jefferson, has transcribed the Watergate tapes. So you could go and look. I think they're available semi-publicly.
Great.
So I can send you them and you can go and check.
Yes, please. I will. Liz, I'm grateful for the time you have spent with me. I really, really appreciate it. I wish you a pleasant day. It's almost weekend. Today is Thursday, and I'm on vacation, which is why I have time to do this during the day. So thank you very much. Okay.
Wonderful.
I will follow your progress.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I will follow your progress with interest.
Thank you for having me.
All the best.